Hello, Rabbi Jacobson here, and we will be speaking about taking one action changes everything. Much talk and much discussion you find around the power of ideas, innovations, methodologies, ideologies, the thought process. And we find a lot less about the power of deed, of action itself. Even though it's a well-known idiom that in any success in business, they say it's 10% idea and 90% execution. Some even say 1% idea, 99% execution. But despite that fact, little is known about what is this power called implementing something, action. We are creatures, and we see ourselves as being unique and superior in our thought and our speech, in contrast to other species. Action, every creature on earth acts, but the ability to process in thought and speaking about it and sharing is uniquely human. Even though animals do have their form of communication, but not the extent. They don't have talk radio, for example. They don't have therapists where they don't have people talking on top of each other and yelling at each other. They don't have that whole world called, let's call it intellectual property, with people suing each other over patents and over copyrights, etc. But human beings have that. And yet, action seems to have a power that all the thought processes in the world. Take, for example, most basic need of all of us, which is called love. We all know what that is, right? Or we think we know. We know that we need it. We don't really know what it is. So you can talk about love from day till night, and until you don't have someone you hug and kiss and in some way embrace in a loving way, it's talk. You can think about love, but it's not the action. So someone will say, it's enough for me to just go read all the books on love and romance and so on. No, it's not going to fill your need. The need is based on an action, having somebody in your life, having someone you can physically relate to, touch, experience. Once you have that, yes, of course, love is not a tangible physical thing. You can love someone even if they're a million miles away. But there's an element of expression that is, on the physical world, power of action can be overestimated. So that's why I want to talk about that power, because especially interestingly, in mystical thought, in Jewish mystical thought, you would think that the mystics, if we're all people, if we're all creatures of thought and speech, the mystics are even more so because they're abstract, mystical, ethereal souls. And yet, especially in Jewish mysticism, specifically, I would say, uniquely, the power of action actually has more power than the power of meditation and other mystical systems. That's what I want to address, because dissecting the anatomy of the deed, really gives us an appreciation of a dimension of our lives that we really do not fully appreciate, to be honest. Obviously, everybody understands the basic thing, that to say, I care about you, or to say, I'll be there, and to be there is not the same thing. We all understand that if you go into, let's say, make a pitch to an investor, and the investor says, my heart's with you, my mind's with you, my soul's with you, my God's with you, but they don't sign a check, the bottom line, there's no commitment. So talk is cheap. And we know this. Many people, when they're still novices, have to be taught. You want to close the deal. You don't want just nice words. You don't want them to say, I like what you're doing. You want them to commit. And commitment is also a form of action, something concrete. So I believe that by understanding deeper, on a deeper level, this power of action, we can come to, as I said, appreciate, and not just appreciate, understand ourselves better, and even control our lives in a better way. As always, whenever you're dealing with human activity or human, I would say the human condition, we learn everything through experience. Most of us have not been taught in our homes and schools how you function. I'm not talking about medically, biologically. Psychologically and emotionally and spiritually, we learn from trial and error. There are very few classes, if at all, that teach you how do you function, what makes you tick. So again, if you go to a biology class or any type of medical training, of course it teaches you how your systems and organisms, an organism, and different parts of your being function. Whether it's the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, or the heart, the liver, the mind, the general physiological structure of the human being. But when it comes to areas that are far more the area of how do you experience things, how do you relate to things, from the youngest of age, we really aren't taught much. So we learn either from what we see, or from what we see that may even be distorted. As a matter of fact, many of us, by the time we're thinking about it, we've already been hurt in the process of how we function because we were forced to react to dysfunctional, unhealthy adults around us. So you've learned to really become evasive, or learned how to, how to run the obstacle course, the minefields of life. So of course you'll say, one second, what about psychology? It's interesting with psychology, besides the fact that there's so many schools of thought that are so confusing and so many different opinions, a lot of it is focused on helping others, not about helping yourself. A lot of it is focused dealing with a problem. What does the healthy psyche look like? Very few really can give you a picture like that. Did Freud have a healthy psyche? Did he build his psychology based on healthy experiences? Or he had an overbearing Jewish mother which defined a lot of his attitudes, which I'm not dismissing. And what was it based on? Empirical experience. When Jewish mysticism, you actually get a map of the soul, that's objective map, and then you can juxtapose that of where you stand in that context. So literally, it's like getting an x-ray of your body. You ever see when you get, let's say, x-ray of your lungs? You'll see the doctor will always put it on a screen, your x-ray, and then he'll put near it healthy lungs, clear lungs, and can say, here's the healthy lungs, now compare, here there's a shadow, here there's a block, God forbid, here's this, here's that. So you have a backdrop of so-called something healthy, and then you can compare. The same thing with x-rays of your teeth, or with CAT scans. So here's what a healthy heart looks like. An unhealthy heart will immediately appear differently. So the question is, can we get a snapshot, a CAT scan of God's mind, so to speak, or a x-ray of the soul? The answer is yes. Based on the Zohar, based on the writings of the Arizal, based especially on the writings of the Tanja, Rabbi Zalman and Tanja. I mentioned that in your honor. You get a snapshot of what this soul looks like. And I've talked about different aspects of the soul in different classes. I'm going to be focused on primarily this thing that connects to action. So here's how he puts it. It's very fascinating and very, in a way, I can't say simple, but it's clear. So just like the body has parts, right? We have limbs and organs. And of course, on a deeper level, we have cellular structure and DNA and the genetics material, etc. Same thing, the soul has components. Obviously, let's qualify this. Does not mean physical components. It's ethereal components. You know, like we say, you need love. You're not going to find inside of you with an x-ray a place of you that needs love. Do you need love here or here? In the physical body, you can say for example, your heart needs certain nutrients. Your body needs certain nutrients, and they're localized. Certain parts of the body need calcium. Certain need other type of vitamins and minerals and nutrients. Comes to the soul, it's not quite as localized. But the same thing, a human being needs love. Just like we need oxygen. A human being needs clarity. A human being needs an equilibrium. equilibrium. These are all needs. They're ethereal needs, but they're still needs. And they're still another part of your system. So here is where the map becomes so valuable, because just like you have the physical map, you can also identify the so-called soul map. So what do we have? You may be familiar with this, that I've talked about a number of times. The 10 faculties. Now remember, we're talking the conscious now, the conscious faculties. The 3 intellectual, the 3 cognitive faculties, and 7 emotional ones. I'm not really going to elaborate on them, I just want to mention them quickly, because these are essentially the building blocks that define your conscious experiences. You process things with your mind, which breaks into 3 steps, that process. Chachma, Bina, Dat, that's the 3 cognitive. You conceive, that's an idea. You develop, and you conclude. Every intellectual process has those 3 steps. You know, let's say you have a problem, you struggle with a dilemma, you come up with, I got an idea. The idea may not pan out, may not end up being a good idea, so you'll come up with another idea. But an idea is just a spark. The idea needs to be developed, needs to be fleshed out. That's Bina. The spark is Chachma. And Das is the conclusion. Yeah, this is correct. It resonates. It's ready to move on to the next step, which we'll call the 7 emotions. So in a healthy human being, it's the mind that begins the processing of every given situation. Because if not, you can be taken advantage of. You can be manipulated emotionally. So you want your mind to be, so to speak, your, what can I say? It's like your scout. Before you date someone, you do a little research. Why are you doing research? Because you don't want to just fall into a situation, meet somebody, and find that person is a jerk or is unhealthy. So what does the mind do? The mind researches. You talk to friends, you talk to people. Then you may go on a date, and you have your guard up, and you let your mind take over. If your mind does not, often we can get ourselves into trouble. That's what emotions do. Now, this doesn't mean we don't want to have emotions. It means you need to walk cautiously. Say the due diligence of any process. You're in real estate. Here's a property. Here's an offer. You want to research it. You want to find out all the details. You're not going to just say, oh, hey, my heart really likes this. You get yourself into trouble again. Now, once you do the due diligence and the mind has done its job, then you could say, okay, I have a good instinct. I have a bad instinct. Even though even if it's good on paper, I still don't like it. Something bothers me intuitively, emotionally. So emotions are so-called, think of them as being guided by. The mind is like the tour guide, and the emotions is the experience. The mind will say, this seems a good idea, and then your heart enters. And the heart breaks down into 7 emotional experiences, and they are. Again, briefly, if you know my Omer book that I've done, other places you can check it out more in detail, but I'll just be brief. 7 emotions on the spectrum. Obviously, we have many more than 7, but the 7 are like 7 basic building blocks that break down into more. And they are chesed, love, and kindness. That's an emotion. But you want to love something that your mind has said this is a good thing to love. You don't want to love something that the mind says is not a good thing to love. Then comes gevura, which is the opposite, the antithesis of love is what? Is discipline. If love is giving, gevura is withholding. Or I should say measuring. How much should you give? How the flow should be a healthy flow, not just giving without any reciprocity or without any measure or balance. Then you have Tiferet, which is compassion. It also is sometimes called balance, harmony. That's 3. The 4th is Netzach, which is determination, ambition, drive. It's another emotional feeling. Often competition brings that out, the need to drive determination. Number 5 is humility, which again, the antithesis to ambition is humility. Number 6 is bonding, connecting with something deeply, not just having an interaction, but a connection, a real bond. It's called foundation. And finally, number 7, malchut. I like to translate it as dignity. It's a sense of sovereignty. It's a sense of feeling like a king or a queen, feeling special, a majesty about things. Basically, you can feel like self-esteem. You can have 6 powerful emotions, but if you don't have dignity, you don't have self-esteem, they will be weak. They won't have that that sense of self that's so important to him, self-confidence, self-esteem necessary. So here's not the place to elaborate because, as I said, I want to stick to the topic, but we need to talk about these because these are the faculties that everything you do is in some way a combination of the 10 I just mentioned. It could be the emotions and the mind working hand in hand. There can be conflicts too. You could have your mind telling you one thing, your emotions tell you another thing. So this doesn't mean it's all peaceful, but bottom line is, these are the faculties. Now, the thing with faculties are like organs. They're like components that constitute your so-called psyche, your soul. And I qualify again, the conscious faculties. We're not even discussing now the superconscious forces that define your faculties. But there's something else that's necessary, which is expression. You could have a brilliant mind, but it could be locked in your brain and you don't ever express it. How often are we tongue-tied and we have something to say and we don't say it? We're shy. We're self-conscious. So the question is, how does a human being express themselves? Faculties do not tell you. You could have love in your heart, but you don't know how to express it. Or you express it in the wrong ways. So the Baal Tanja, the Rabbi Nizam, introduces another set of 3, what he calls garments. Think of it this way. The human body is your core skeleton and your bodily organs and limbs and so on. When you put on clothing, besides to protect yourself from the weather and besides to look dignified, there's another thing that clothing does. It expresses yourself. You can express. So the interesting thing, and this is something people are not really aware of, but it's so simple once you hear it, and it works like this. How many ideas do you have in your brain? Who knows? It could be millions. It could be hundreds of thousands. There's millions of ideas. Anything you've ever processed, anything you've ever seen, anything you've ever memorized, sits in your brain like a hard drive. But what happens if your hard drive is working and you have no way to access it on your screen? So it's very valuable, but it doesn't have any practical application. So what he explains in the human psyche, and this is, like I said, and the first time you hear it, it may be a little new, but once you think about yourself in this context, you change the way you see yourself, literally overnight. I'm not saying you change who you are, but you change who you see yourself. So the faculties that we have, whether it's any one of the 10 faculties I just mentioned, the 3 cognitive or the 7 emotional, those are faculties. You can be born with a brilliant mind. That doesn't mean you use it. That doesn't mean you use it to capacity. You know, it's like think of you could have an automobile that can drive 180 miles an hour. How many people drive 180 miles an hour? So besides your sheer brain power, or the same thing with emotions, you could be a very loving person, but you may have grown up in an environment that love was not easily expressed. Even though in your heart you have it, but no one ever taught you the technique, how to express love. Or when you do express love, it's very distorted. You don't know how to stop giving, or you don't know when to start giving, all the different distortions possible. So what he explains in the Tanja, this Rabbi Nizam, is that there's another component to the human being, to the human psyche, and he calls it levushim, garments, and I'll explain more why they're garments in a moment. And they are essentially the only 3 ways we can express ourselves in this universe. And one is thought. That's the expression to yourself. You're consciously thinking. Like I said before, you can have a hard drive, but if you can't retrieve the content, it's like blocked in your brain, ideas. So the first is machshava, which is accessing an idea that you're consciously aware of. Like whatever it is that you're right now consciously thinking about, let's say you're focusing on what I'm saying, that would be called seichel, is being transferred into machshava. So intelligence is being focused now and accessing through machshava a particular idea. If I start talking to you now about, you have a lot of ideas in your mind that you may have thought about 5 minutes ago, or 10 minutes ago, or yesterday, but that's not what you're accessing right now. You're accessing one particular idea. Well, that's hopefully, if you're focused and concentrated, it's one idea. If you're not, you can be scattered and be accessing many ideas and be distracted. But you can't have a million ideas going on at once. in your conscious thought process. Again, you may have a million ideas in your brain, but there's no way you're accessing them all the time, at the same time, conscious way. So real concentration would be someone who's able to access one idea and put their complete conscious focus in their machshava level, in the garment. This is right now what I am focusing on. That's expression number one. But it's only to yourself. Thought, nobody knows your thoughts. You can change your thoughts right now. Unless someone's a mind reader, they could not know what you're thinking. You could change it completely to something else. It could be nonsense, it could be valuable, precious, whatever. The second form of expression is dibur, speech. That's expressing to someone else. Now, you could have a thought that you don't express. You could choose not to say something. You could choose actually to say a lie. You can say something that you're not thinking. But that doesn't matter. The point is, dibur is another second form of expression. And to shut the sound there. Do you know how to do shut the sound? It's fine, it'll stop in a minute. And just going to this sound and making mute, it's all right.
He stood up, look what happened.
Nothing to do with standing up. You go down to the bottom left, where the...
Right.
No, you don't want to shut this whole thing here. Just leave it since it's in... They may try again, fine. Okay. So the third form of expression is called maisa, action, which of course is the focus of this discussion here, but you can only really understand it when you contrast it with others. What's action? Action isn't just expression to another. Action is leaving some permanent mark. So for example, I may be speaking now, and if it wasn't recorded, you hear it, and then after that, it dissipates, meaning either you remember it, you don't remember it, but there's no record of it. Again, my dibur right now, my speech is being recorded, so it's becoming a maisa, an action. It's engraving images and sound in this equipment here. But dibur, speech, doesn't have to be that way. You can speak and then it does not leave a record. Maisa is a record. So for example, maisa would be like a potter makes a pot. A jeweler makes a piece of jewelry. An architect builds a building. An author writes a book. An artist creates art. What makes that unique? What makes it unique is that you don't no longer need the creator of that piece of work to be there. When it comes to thought, if there's no one thinking, there's no thought. When it comes to speech, if there's no one speaking, there's no speech. Again, I'm not talking about the technology that it's always connected to the so-called creator of that expression. And as soon as that person stops speaking, they stop speaking. An act is an act of permanence. You don't no longer have to be. You build a building. The architect no longer has to be in that building anymore. A piece of art, it could be artists that lived hundreds of years ago. Music, and they left a piece of work. Had they just spoken about it, had they just thought about it, it would never have created anything. So thought, again, is expression to yourself, speech to another, and action is like essentially leaving something that's outside of yourself, something that remains beyond you. Now, in a healthy process, this is how it works. You are filled with faculties. That's the koiches hanefesh, that's called. Not levushim, koiches. That would be the core building blocks of your psyche and your being, which, as I said, on a conscious level, consists of 3 cognitive and 7 emotional. The healthiest type of person is someone who's 3 cognitive and 7 emotional are in a very solid place. As I said, the cognitive always, anything that you process always begins with an idea, you develop it, and you conclude it. Many of us have ideas that never come into fruition. Many of us have ideas that come to development, but they don't come to conclusion. So that is 3 steps. In a healthy person, the cognitive always precedes the emotional. Because if not, as I said before, if we just follow our emotions, then it becomes impulsive behavior, because emotions are impulsive. So the healthiest type of emotion is one that's guided by the mind. I mentioned before, due diligence. Someone suggests a date, you do research before you meet somebody because you want to know the person is not an idiot or a jerk or healthy, and not someone that's healthy. Even if you go on a date, you don't just let your guard down. You use your mind. You don't let your emotions get the better of you, even if you like the person, even if they may seem right. You make sure your mind is checking out, making sure that this is right, this is healthy. I mean, how many of us are manipulated emotionally? All the time we're manipulated. What do you think advertising is? I mentioned this many times here about this guy I met. He used to come to this class a lot. He was a psychologist. I met him years later, and he tells me he's in advertising. So I said, how'd you get from psychology to advertising? He said, I'm doing exactly the same thing, but there I was healing people, now I'm manipulating them. Which is a very interesting way of defining advertising, manipulating human emotions. Of course, it's exactly what it is. It's creating images and words that will manipulate your emotions to want to purchase that item. It's the whole basis of advertising. Now, this doesn't always mean that it's a bad product. You know, just like the guy that said, not just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean that no one wants to get me. Just because it's manipulation doesn't mean the product doesn't have value. But it's trying to get your attention among a clutter of thousands and thousands of data being streamed toward us all the time, overwhelming us, trying to get your attention. That's what good. So I said, okay, very nice. So now he says, and I'm making 5 times as much. Then I was a psychologist. I said, okay, so now in a few years from now, you can go back into psychology and heal all the people you manipulated. You know, like they say, the radar detectors and the radars are manufactured by the same company, like the cat and mouse. You manufacture a better cat, so you have to have a better mouse. Mouse trap, whatever it may be. So it's like you create the problem. In Yiddish, there was always an expression. The woman says, "Mein Mann macht mich krank, und danach nimmt mich zu the beste Doktoren." My husband makes me sick, and then he takes me to the best doctors. Okay, this is it's a Yiddish joke. Back to the topic at hand. So what we have here is like this. Okay, so faculties. But as I said, faculties have nothing to do with expression. And this is a tremendous example that I remember and understanding a lot of things in my childhood. You have, for example, students in a classroom. So often, the shy students are seen as the stupid ones by an untrained eye. Because they don't speak, they seem fearful, they seem hesitant, they seem tentative. And sometimes the big mouths that talk sound smart because they always have answers and so on. A little do we know, you find out a little later, that sometimes the shyest child in the class, the shyest student, is the smartest one. And for whatever reason, they don't express themselves. They could be inhibited, they could be silenced at home, they could just be a temperament that's very introverted. So there are 1,000 reasons you can explain it. Not even unhealthy reasons necessarily. So a good teacher understands that and never confuses a student that's not expressing him or herself as being stupid. But how would you define that in, let's use it, the Hasidic, called algorithm or formula for this type of child? The answer would be a smart mind. So in the faculties, let's say 1 out of 100, the student is a 90. And in the levushim, the garments, the student is an out of 100, a 10 out of a 90. So it's like 90 over 10. 90 in brain power and 10 in expression. I'm talking particularly now thought and speech. Well, all expression, thought, speech, or action. It's not relevant to our discussion. I just want to make the point. Now you have people who are less brilliant. Let's say they're 80 out of 100 in brilliance. I'm just talking about the mind. We could also talk emotions, the same idea. And they may have 20% expression based on either training and so on. So what would a good teacher do? A good teacher sees a person who has a 90 to 10. You work on the 10 to make it 20, 30, because you can imagine such a brilliant person. Imagine if they could express themselves. So you have to figure a way how to get that person out of their shell and have more confidence and build that confidence. And then as the ratio goes up, meaning 90 over 20 over 30 over 40, then you're talking not even building more brain power. It's building more expression. So you'll have people who are brilliant minds. I'm just using that example for just to make the point. But they are very weak in expression. I've seen people give a talk, and their ideas are great, but they simply don't know how to speak. So they say point B before they say point A, and they say point D before they say point C. So any normal person listening sees the whole thing sounds like a jumble. But if you listen closely, you see there's some brilliant ideas, but no one ever taught them organized speech. For that matter, organized thought. That needs to be taught. There are people who have brilliant minds. You say something, they get it right away. But then, because their mind does not think in an organized way, their whole ideas are all disorganized. So even their thinking process is messed up. So the power of faculties does not reflect on the power of expression. Then you have the exact opposite. You have people who don't have at all, I can't say no brains, but everybody has something. But let's put it this way, comparatively speaking, low intelligence, but extremely polished expression. Some of them are con artists, actually. Con artists doesn't have to be brilliant, but they're very good at the gift of gab. They open their mouths and they're very convincing. So I'm just using, again, extremes. Obviously, most of people are somewhere in between. But here's the exact opposite. You'd have maybe 10% intelligence and 90% levushim are excellent. And they have it figured out. Many survivors are that way. They know what to say because they needed to figure out how to survive. So they were very cool and very sharp with their tongues. And they're very, very, what's the word, shrewd. And they know how to maneuver. But that's a levushim, a garment power, not a faculty power. Now, obviously, you want to have both. Just to give it, this was one application of how garments and faculties work. Now, the reason it's called garments is very simple. What's a garment? A garment, on one hand, is meaningless. It hangs in your closet, and you don't wear it, well, who cares? On the other hand, a garment without it, you don't have a form of expression. So a garment needs to be placed on a body. So the garment on its own is lifeless. It has no power. But placed on a body, it can become the way you are expressing. You want people to see you a certain way, let's say in a dignified way, a certain Shabbos clothing, holiday clothing, a wedding, a party. Or you want to wear a different garment, it expresses. But the garment is not the expressive. The garment is the choice you make, but it's a form of expression. Think of the thought, speech, and action. Thought, speech, and action have no substance. Because it doesn't say what you're thinking about, it doesn't say what you're talking about, it doesn't say what you're acting on. It's three so-called invisible, lifeless garments waiting to be filled up. Think of it like containers. It's like an empty cup. Empty cup has nothing in it. So the faculties is the power. Once you have an idea, that would be like the liquid that you're pouring into this cup, but then you need a cup, because how are you going to transmit and transport the idea from your hard drive to any type of accessible way? You need some garment. That's why it's called garments, because garments can be removed. You can have one thought right now, and you could change it as quickly as you change a garment, just like you change your shirt. You can change what you're thinking about. The faculties you can never change. Your faculties is part of your body. You can't change your body. I'm talking about the core skeleton, so to speak. You can change the garment that you place on the body. You can have blue eyes and wear shades that make your eyes look brown. But that's not the core person. So the core faculties are more or less defined. I should qualify that by saying you can absolutely work on them just like you can exercise your muscles. You can make them stronger. You could also make your faculties stronger. It's not really what I want to talk about, but I just wanted to qualify. But your garments, meaning your thought, speech, and action, you could speak something very valuable, then you can suddenly start speaking some nonsense or even gossip, and God forbid, lashon hara, and things that are not proper. Because speech is a neutral state. It's just a garment. What you're going to use this garment for can be something positive, something negative, or something neutral. In the Kabbalistic and the Hasidic texts, you'll find expressions, for example, soiled garments or clean garments. Because a garment can get soiled. For example, if you use your speech and deed to hurt somebody, to speak badly about someone, to slander someone, God forbid, or your thoughts, you think badly about something, or your action, you do something, what you're doing is your garment gets soiled. It's like a garment that you placed, that you're wearing, but it got muddied, it got dirtied up, soiled. So then the solution is either to remove the garment and replace it with a clean garment, or to clean the garment. That's, again, another discussion, not really for now. I'm just trying to give a picture here. So if you think of yourself that way, everything you do in your life 24/7 is governed by your faculties as they are in direct proportion to your garments. The sad fact is that our faculties obviously are always more powerful than they're being expressed. In other words, you're not going to find anyone that has 100% expression of your capacity, because that requires a tremendous amount of discipline and so on. But you can make your garments more proportionate to your faculties through training. And that's called the conditioning and training and education of a child into an adult. A good education would teach a child organized thought, organized speech, and what to build Maisa action in this world that is productive. Obviously, no education or a distorted education will also teach, but it will teach usually thought, speech, and action that are not going to necessarily produce the best results. So you can have inside a person locked, unbelievable, as that brilliance, tremendous capacity for love, emotions, and all 7 emotions I described from Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Chesed, Yesod, Malchus, and yet their expression may be very little. Like, for example, a criminal. From a Jewish point of view, from a Torah point of view, a criminal has a soul. A criminal may have a lot of good inside them, but their garments are destructive. So no one argues that the criminal may have a great heart, but for whatever reason, that criminal has messed up, and it's never been expressed in the garments, or not been expressed enough, or the garments are controlled by criminal inclinations. So it's a way of looking at anything. Obviously, I use criminal as an extreme, but let's talk just people. I think about this often. People come to see me. I speak to people. Sometimes I see someone has, let's say, a mean streak. You just see they're very bitter, they're very mean, they're just very negative. And I always think in these terms. I say to myself, is this a faculty thing or it's a garment thing? Are they just like born that way? Like, they grew up in a home where their whole home is that environment? Or is it a garment thing? It's the way they learn to survive. And they learn this is some tool. You have people like this. You stand on a line. Some people are very pleasant. And some people, anything you do offends them. This happens on airplane lines. This happens in what they call road rage. A guy told me that other day that, I mentioned that a few months ago, I heard this. He said so to speak, he was on the highway. He cut somebody off. Or, he went into another lane. The guy was honking him. And he pursued him. Some people will pursue someone for miles. But this one is an extreme. He went off on an exit, and the guy still pursued him. He went to an ATM. The guy got out and started punching him. So it's an interesting phenomenon, this road rage. Like, it's like some type of macho thing. I mean, I would define it usually connected to something very insecure, and people think they got to, like, win, on the highway or something, like it's some type of marathon. But I'm not going to analyze road rage right now. My point is that expression is not always reflective of what's really going on inside a person. This is not a justification. You can have a very good person who's not acting in a nice way. That doesn't mean they're a good person. It means that they're under the wrong control. But you could also have a bad person who's behaving beautifully. So obviously we want to have on both ends. But in many ways, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a moment, in the context of how the mystics and the Torah sees this, it's very interesting how it looks at it. Which is greater? Someone that acts good but doesn't have such feelings, or someone that has good feelings but doesn't act good? Now, obviously, destruction is destruction. You hurt somebody, it really makes no difference what your intentions are. Who cares how good of a person? You hurt somebody, you hurt somebody. So there's no denying that action has more damage than a bad thought. But sometimes we actually say that a bad thought about somebody can have more damage than action even. But I'll get back to that shortly. So what we have here is the following. It's somewhat of an X-ray that gives you an image of yourself. Not a physical image, because a physical image, as I said, a physical X-ray will give you a picture of your body, your internal organs, your lungs, etc., your heart, a CAT scan of your mind. But this, what we're describing, gives us a type of ethereal X-ray of our psyche. And everything you do fits into this model. And that is your faculties, which are your powers. I mentioned, again, I'm speaking strictly conscious, not the superconscious, not the subconscious or unconscious. Your cognitive and emotional faculties. And though it's only 10, the 10 obviously interact and cross-pollinate and they're interconnective. So therefore, it's more than just 10. They're constantly working with each other. So if you really were like an analyst, a Kabbalistic or Hasidic analyst, what you would do is, when you see a behavior, you could say, this, what I see, is a combination of Bina, Chesed, and Hoid. I know it means nothing to you. But if you translate it into simple English, it would mean you see somebody who's developed some type of approach, and there's a certain element of love and kindness in there, but there's a certain element of humility. It's just one example. And you can look at any type of behavior, any type of action, anything a person is doing, you can identify it based on these faculties. And then, of course, the second half is the expression. So in a way, helping people heal or grow and become better people requires a very good diagnosis. Are you dealing with a faculty issue? Or are you dealing with an expression issue? Now, the truth is, in most cases, it's expression, interestingly. Because, for example, two people, let's say friends, and they get angry at each other, or spouses, and they're so angry they don't want to talk to each other. And it starts growing, turn into a monster. So what are we dealing with here? Do they stop loving each other? Not necessarily. They may say they have. They may express hatred and stuff like that, but not necessarily the case. It could very well be that maybe superficial, maybe not superficial, but real things in life have worn them down and strained the relationship and caused a lot of tension. And often the real process is that they don't know how to express love when they're challenged. They're good when everything is calm. As soon as there's a little too much duress or too much strain or too much challenges, let's say financial challenges, fertility issues, I'm just talking the usual suspects, sexual issues, other stuff of that nature, then suddenly they're not in their comfort zone, and if they don't have the tools of machshava, dibur, maisa that are effective, they're out of their water. It's like someone who suddenly gets deep in the water and doesn't know how to swim there anymore. They could swim in easier water, but it's only a storm, they don't know what to do. Again, this doesn't justify bad behavior, but that's what then you have to focus on, is how do you help them develop skills? It's so often the case that you see people just don't know the skills, how to argue even. How do you disagree in a menschliche way? Some people have no clue. As soon as they see a disagreement, either they run for cover, some people retreat, some people love confrontation, but resolving it, they both don't know how to do. And usually it's back down to your parents, how they resolved or didn't resolve issues. Which is worse, passive-aggressive or aggressive? Sometimes the silent treatment is much worse than the fighting treatment. Anyone who's experienced it knows it's very, very uncomfortable. Because the silence, you don't even have someone to fight with. This look that you're having to each other, it tells the volumes. Yeah. Nobody knows who I'm talking to. Don't worry. It's off the record. Uh-huh. Okay. We always have to have some scapegoat couple to talk to, I know one thing, you're always on your best behavior here, that's for sure. Right. So the point is that often it comes down to skills. It's like they just don't know what to do. And either because there was no role modeling, no examples, no living examples, dugma chaya, or role modeling, and that often happens. So skills, and what I'm calling garments, are in that case are far more powerful and more necessary than the faculties. Because very often the love is there, but they just don't know how to express it. And even if there's no crisis, how many couples have this issue where one person, what they define as love, the other person says, I love you, I don't have to express it every day. And some people say, no, you have to express it. Some people say you have to purchase a gift. Why do I have to purchase a gift? I love you. Why do I need to spend money too? And you say, well, you really don't believe me? I have to prove it to you? You have these debates. You can imagine which one's the man and which one's the woman, in most cases. And love is expressed very differently. So really broadening your horizons and understanding that there's more than one way to love is very important. You don't need to have one person win or the other person lose. It's a matter of realizing that you love someone, you also love what's important to them, even if it's not important to you at that point. So either you get to understand it or you don't get to understand it. What difference does it make? The bottom line is that you're learning skills, and skills are very different for different people. But it does not necessarily reflect on the love. I've seen situations where a person really loves the other and does not know how to express it well. They have it in their heart, and they have to be taught to express it because the other person can't guess, and sometimes we simply need to be able to say thank you. You can't just say, I mean it. And there's other people who are very good at sending thank you letters, but they don't really always, you don't always feel it's like sincere. It's like saying thank you 50 times in a minute doesn't necessarily mean you're really doing the job. The point is, these are skill things. So let me go back now to the main. All this was like somewhat, and I can't say it's an introduction, it's an understanding of who we are. So now let's talk about the power of an act, an action. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, that we all understand, as I said, in business success, they say 10% an idea, 90% execution. Trust me, I suffer from that all the time. What happens if you have 100% ideas and 0% execution? Then it's not working so well. And some say 1% idea and 99% execution. So you can imagine with that. And you do see people like that. You see people who are dreamers, visionaries, thought people. They know how to think well. But when it comes to implementation, and then you're people that are exact opposites. Excellent in execution, in implementation. They're just great at it. The truth is successful ventures usually have both. Because you need someone with ideas and you need someone that gets it done. My father, may he rest in peace, was an unbelievable person, a dreamer, a visionary, and he did a lot of practical big things, but it was sheer force of his will that got it into action. But he was not as fundamentally an implementer. He lived in dreams. He was a journalist, and he published a newspaper, so it wasn't like he wasn't getting anything done. He got much done. He published a weekly deadline newspaper. Try that out. It's not that easy to do. But it was really the sheer power of his will. Just to give you an example. I used to have conversations with him, And I read this book. I have some similarities to him, so I bend over backwards not to be that way, to also complement it with the other side. So I was reading this book called the Small Business Bible, something like that. Now, only people who don't know business read books like that, as you can imagine. People who know just know it in the instinct. They don't have to read books. So I'm reading this book, and I find a very interesting thought there. What's the thought? It says that business people don't like to invest with creative people, with artistic types. Why? Because artistic types are very much living in their own creative world. And when they express themselves, either in a piece of art or music or writing, their ego has been released in their art. And they've finished the job. A business person, on the other hand, needs to now go sell it. And the more customers you get, the more money you're going to make. The artist has already freedom, feels the job is over. So he looks at the businessman as some type of peddler. Okay, he likes money, doesn't appreciate my brilliant art. So they're very different mindsets. And initially you'd think the visionary, the artist thinks he's superior to the business because the business guy, all he cares about is a few bucks. Doesn't appreciate the fine art and ethereal nature of the everything that went into this creativity. He's just busy selling. For him, it's like selling pots on a corner, But the book makes the point that, so therefore, business people don't like to invest in artists because artists don't know how to treat with them. And the point the book makes is the exact opposite is true. It is the artist that is the arrogant, egoistic person. Because all he thinks about is, I got myself expressed. I'm already on a canvas, on a book, whatever it is. And it's the businessman that is going to actually do the service of getting this value to millions of people, hopefully. Whereas for the artist, even if 10 people see it, that's all he needs. His ego is satisfied. So who's more egotistic? And they never come and communicate to each other. So I decided to tell my father, share with my father with this. You got to hear his answer. It was brilliant. So I said to my father, Ta, what do you think about it? We spoke in Yiddish. I said, what do you think about this? He says, it's an excellent idea for an article. You should write something about it. Even this he turned into a piece of art. He didn't even get the message. He says, that's a great idea. He got the idea, but it's again an idea. I said, I'm talking about your business. There's ways to... So he says, stop with the... I'm good at mathematics, so my father used to always tell me, you with your numbers. I said, it doesn't add up. It doesn't add. He says, stop with the numbers. It's a brilliant idea. This is a person who's machshava and very far from mice. Now again, I want to qualify. I love my father, and as I said, his sheer will, he got a lot done, more than most people who live in action even. But that's not where he dwelled. He lived in his mind. He lived in his dreams, and then he got them into action. But I thought it was a very interesting that's why I'm sharing it, because in the Talmud there's this question. In the tractate called Kiddushin, the question is asked, what is greater, thought, or actually study, or action? The words in the Torah, Talmud or Maisa? And the sages debated. Is Talmud Gadol, which means study, or you can say in this case thought, process, or Maisa Gadol, or is action more important? And you can make a case for both, because on one hand, we know, as I said, in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos in the tractate, in the Ethics of the Fathers, which are studied and read the weeks between Passover and Shavuos, and some people continue reading it throughout the summer till Rosh Hashanah. So it says, Lo ha-medrash shikar ela ha-maisa. Not the medrash is primary. Medrash, not study and pilpul and discussion and debate and counter arguments and so on. But maisa ikar, action, is paramount. Which makes sense, because you can live in your head and never get anything done if you're just less busy with study. Or the other way around. What's action without a thought process? It's a hollow thing. It has power, but it's empty. And of course, Rabbi Akiva in the Talmud comes to a conclusion that study is greater. Because Talmud Gadol shemevil de maisa, because you have both. Study will bring to action. Action doesn't necessarily bring to study. So in other words, thought will bring to action, but action may not bring to thought. That's what he says. Just for the record, it says in some books, some of the holy books say that this is today, when Mashiach comes, action will be paramount. Which of course begs the question, why? Maybe if we have time, we'll get to that. So here's the thing. There's no question that if you talk about pure power and pure firepower, thought is stronger than action. Because thought, as I said before, is the container for your mind's ideas. For example, you can never express in speech and in writing the intensity of the power of your ideas. You can express some of it, but some of it is simply not expressed. Liba lepuma legalia is an expression. That which is really in your heart, you can't really express in your mouth. That's why you often say, I love you, but can I really put it in words? I don't have enough words to describe how much I love you. I don't have enough words to describe how much I appreciate something. Because you're basically saying, because words are containers and they're just not enough. So on one hand, thought is far closer, so to speak, to your intimate thoughts or ideas or feelings. In other words, in the garment industry itself, in the three garments, it's the thought garment that is closest to the faculties, because it's still to yourself. When you speak, you can't say everything that's in your mind. Now, a good speaker will convey a brilliant idea, but it's still a step away. Speech is always going to be a step away from thought. And therefore, there'll be things limited. That's why you'll find there's remez, you allude to things, you hint to things, because it just doesn't have the same intensity. It has other qualities, which we'll talk about, but that... And maisa, in action, in writing, it's even less. Speech, at least you're in control of your words. So I'm speaking now, so in a way it's connected to my thoughts, and I'm expressing as much as I can. But action, you're not even there anymore. So putting it in words on paper, again, you can convey very profound ideas, but it's not going to have the intensity of speech. For example, when a person is very impassioned and very passionate about an idea, they can really Nafshi yotze bedabre, it says. Your soul goes expressed in your words. And you see passion. You feel the emotions in the words. And when you write it, it does not have quite the same intensity. I mean, there's tricks of the trade, how to express something with exclamation points and with different words. But it's not the same as when you hear that person. You hear a person, for example, expressing their grief in words is going to be a lot more intense than when you read it. Or for that matter, their joy. And of course, thought is always more intense. So essentially, from thought, speech, and action, the intensity level, so-called the temperature goes down, so to speak. And I should mention that there is also the concept of, I remember one of my mentors saying to me about somebody, he said, he's a great koyach hasbara, which means a great way of explaining things. So I saw that he was leading to some type of insult. So he says to me, he can explain something to other people and they'll understand it, even though he himself doesn't understand a word what he's saying. So there's an interesting concept of that, where the dibur, you explain better than you yourself. So that's just a little qualification. There are people, I guess, that can do that. So what do we have here? So it seems to be, based on this, it seems that a gradation goes like this, from the intensity of thought to less intensity of speech and even less in action. But then you see something that seems to counter that. When you have to speak, it takes a lot more effort than when you have to think about it. Anyone who's ever given a speech knows. If speech is so much more intense, and if thought is so much more intense and speech is less, then you already thought it through, so what's the big thing? Just say a few words. But you see, no. When you get to speak, not just because you're shy or you have stage fright. It's because there's something that you have to express in speech, and you have to dig deeper in your thoughts to be able to express it. So how does that jive with what I just said? If speech is more intense, if thought is more intense, then speech should be easy. You already did the heavy lifting. Now just a matter, get it in. And writing is even more difficult. Try to write a clear idea. It will take you much more time than to deliver it in a speech. In a speech, you control it, you can change things, you can see the body language of the audience, you can repeat things. In writing, once it's published, that's it. You can't go back and change anything. So writing takes a lot more effort to convey the same idea that you're speaking, and the speaking takes a lot more effort than the thought. So here is how the interesting way the mystics, the Kabbalists and the Hasidic masters explain it. They say it's true. If you're talking about pure power of revelation, so to speak, of intensity, thought is always more intense. There's no question about it. But there's some power that God invested in expression. So we say it every Friday night. We say, Seif Maisa b'machshava tchila. You know that expression? What does that mean? The end of the action, the final product of the final and last garment, the external action, is rooted in the beginning of the thought. What is that? How does that fit in here? Doesn't it seem like it works like this? Thought, speech, action. That's that. You think about something, you discuss it, you consult, you review, and then you act on it. A similar expression is used when we say that the end, no, it's seifam b'tchilasan. The end is wedged in the beginning and the beginning in the end. So when you, for example, let's say you want to build yourself a mansion at home, and you come up with a brilliant idea, and you consult with architects and designers, and you have great. And they come up with the blueprints, and you have it all. You thought about it, you spoke about it, you even have a blueprint. And someone will say, okay, so what's missing? They say, everything is missing. I don't have the house. I need my home. And if they finish 90% of it and they don't finish that, you can't live in it. Anyone that's ever rebuilt the house knows the aggravation of contractors. So what do you have? That until you don't have the Seif Maisa, the end of the product, the end product, the machshava is not, it's meaningless. It's almost worthless. It's true that if you started with the action without without this thought and the strategy and the discussions and the consultation, you wouldn't have a home either. You'd have a mess. You need it to be guided by the thought and the speech. But bottom line is action. The question is why? If you think about it philosophically, why shouldn't thought and speech be enough? So the Kabbalists put it this way, because God wanted to have a world, a physical world. He was not interested in spiritual realms alone. He wanted a physical reality. And therefore he infused into action a power that even thought cannot have, and definitely not speech. Yes, he wanted the action to be guided by and informed by proper strategy and by proper review and consultation and speech. But there's a power in an act that thought and speech can never have. And as a result, it elicits something even deeper than thought. It elicits action, something that the deepest thoughts can never express. So I mentioned in the beginning an example, love. We all need love. But if you don't have it in any tangible way, it's a nice concept to have love, very nice. I want it, I need it. But if you don't have a person in your life that you can hug or embrace, or in some way express a physical expression of love, and I don't just mean the physical, I mean to say a tangible, mice thing, you can think and talk about it the rest of your life. You can write a million books, romantic novels. But that's not love. Love is an action involved. And when there's the act, it completely overshadows the thought and the speech. Now, obviously, healthy love, you want it to be, as I said, guided by loving speech and by loving thoughts. But what if you only have the thought and the speech? It's a nice theory and it's a nice words. It's not the bottom line. So, and interestingly, when you think about this, action, even though we all say, of course we want action has in it a very mysterious power. It has a power that technically it's weaker than speech and thought, and it's, as I said, in its firepower, but in it contains an enormous force that changes things, that a thought and speech can never change, which is tremendous, which is really essentially one of the big philosophical quandaries that many people, thinkers, have when they come to Jewish and Torah thought. I'll tell you why. It's one thing when you study halacha, which is Jewish law. So Jewish law, of course, is based on understanding the different intricate details of what the Torah requires of us. What is the laws of Shabbos? You have a whole tractate called Shabbos of the 39 different forbidden works and how they break down into many other subsets, Avos Malachas and Tuldas and so on and so forth. Laws of Passover, laws of kosher, anything, the laws of mikveh, whatever you want, there's laws and laws. And they all are trying to figure out, similar to law in the secular world, the details of what is legally required, what's permitted, what's forbidden, what's optional, and all the different opinions. Fine. That is, in that sense, that's a technical law. So there, obviously, action is critical because it ends up being, what's the halacha? What am I supposed to do? After all the arguments and discussion, what's the Shammai says you can't do it, Hillel says you could. And then comes the consensus, or the ruling is, let's say in most cases like Hillel, that's permitted. Fine, now I know what to do. You go to a rabbi, a question is the chicken kosher, not kosher. So there could be debates back and forth, then comes some type of conclusion. But here's where the dilemma comes. That's fine when you're dealing with halacha, with real, tangible, concrete laws. But what about on the spiritual realm? What's greatest? So you'll go across the board. You look through all spiritual disciplines, in the East, in the West, whatever, and you'll find it always comes down to the more abstract you are, or I'll put it this way, the more meditation, the higher you reach. You reach the highest places through meditation, through mindfulness, through using your mind to imagine, to dream, to transcend, to reach great heights. When you come into Jewish mysticism, there's something completely different. There's the focus, it says, on mitzvahs maisius, which is action. That you can reach greater spiritual heights through an act than through a meditation. I'm actually taking this from a letter that the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote to a conference on Jewish mysticism in London many years ago. And he made this point. He says Jewish mysticism teaches you can reach greater spiritual heights through an action than through a meditation. Now, if you think about it from a mystical point of view, it's completely counterintuitive. As I said, halacha, it's a law. Law is law. Got to know what to do. But when you're dealing with the mystical realms, the spiritual realms, it would seem that less action, the higher you go. However, one thing is missing. If you remember a few weeks ago, I spoke about this, that Judaism does not see spirituality at the end of the world. Spirituality is a stepping stone to something called godliness and holiness. So spirituality is a tremendous tool, but it's a tool. It's a interface to reach something that's greater than spirituality. And that God is as close to the physical world as he is to the spiritual worlds. And therefore, invested in the physical, something that all the spiritual worlds do not have. If you want to read more on this, you reach chapter 36 in Tanja. Unbelievable chapter in describing that all the spiritual worlds are very spiritual levels. But at the end of the day, they're spiritual, they're not physical. And there's something about the action that has an investment of the divine that reaches greater than all the spiritual heights. As I said, it's counterintuitive, because you'll ask most people, they'll tell you, the more spiritual a person is, the less religious they are. The more religious, the less spiritual. What are they really saying? The more spiritual you are, the more broad-minded you are, and you don't really care about the details. Who cares you put on a switch on Shabbos or not? What difference does it make? Who cares whether you eat matzah like an egg or like an olive, or more or less? Why these details? Details sound very dogmatic and sound very narrow. It's very good for people who are nitpickers, as they say, or OCD. But the spiritual person has a broad mind, and you see the big horizon, and you're not so involved in details. And yet in Judaism, you find that paradox, that through the details you get more of the spirit than you do through the broad horizons, which is a paradox. What did Shlomo HaMelech say? King Solomon said when God told him to build the first temple. So he says a very powerful verse. He says, Shamayim v'shmei Shamayim lo yichalkalucha. The heavens and the heaven of heavens can't contain you. Afki abayis hazeh, this physical abode, a physical little structure, the heavens and the heavens of heavens can't contain you. And a little physical, relatively speaking, a small structure on earth is going to contain you? Bit me, he asks like a question. And God responds with the same verse and just reads it, B'nechusa reads it. Yeah, read that verse without a question. That's exactly right. Heavens and heavens of heavens cannot contain me, only this specific, because this is what I want. I want a dwelling place on this earth, in a physical place, and I want it made out of physical items. I don't want a spiritual meditation alone. I want gold, silver, copper, because that's the challenge. How do you bring the deepest spirituality in a mundane world? That's far, far greater than being spiritual in a spiritual world. What's the big thing? A fish in water obviously is going to love water. In the dry land, where there's no water, would you still aspire to the spirit? So what you have is a tremendous insight into the power of action. The power of action. As the Maimonides puts it, one act changes the world forever. He says in the Laws of Tshuva, he writes, that la'olam, a person should always see themselves and the world as two ends of a scale. The scales that go like this. And that all the positive actions and all the negative actions balance each other out, so the scale is equal. And one good deed, ma'asachas, dibur echad, machshavachas, all three. He uses all three garments, the action, the speech, or the thought, but of course action more than anything, tips the scale. One act tips the scale. So some people say, one act? We're talking about a world of 7 billion people. 7 billion people. Trillions between the other species, animals, vegetable, mineral. Trillions of cells. Even more than trillions. One act tips the scale. So thank God, science today confirms that idea. You've heard of the butterfly effect. The way they put it is that a butterfly flutters its wings in Kansas City and it can create a typhoon in Singapore. Not sure why those two cities are chosen, but let's put it, it could be any city for that matter. Why? Because today in the modern physics we know there's no such thing as small and large. Size does not matter. One, God forbid, mutant cell among the 75 trillion cells in our body. 75 trillion. Not billion, not million, trillion. As I said, it's the only thing more than the USA deficit is our trillions. One mutant cell, one extra chromosome can wreak unbelievable havoc. You say, what's the big thing? 1 out of 75 trillion? Well, try computer programming. You can have millions of lines of programming and stick in a little dot somewhere. Or take away a dot. What will happen? The whole thing won't work. Or definitely big parts of it. Well, big dot, one dot among millions of lines of programming code. Because it has nothing to do with size. On a microscopic level, it's not about size, it's quality, it's not quantity. So to someone to say, what's the big thing? A little act, a detail, who cares? Is not understanding the potency of an action. So we have, as you know, in the Hebrew alphabet, we have letters, 22 letters. And one, maybe the most famous, or one of the most famous letters is the Hey, letter Hey. The fifth letter. It's named the name of God, Yud Kei, Vav Kei, Yud Hey, and then a Vav Hey. Hey. Now, as you know, the Hebrew alphabet, besides the meaning in each letter, and besides the number of each letter, which is gematria, like in this case 5, there's also the structure of each letter. And it all hints to and alludes to and indicates on different spiritual energies. So explained in this form, in the books, based on the Talmud that says, Behei nivra elam hazeh, that with the letter Hey, God created this physical world. With the letter Yud, he created the spiritual world. Which makes sense. A Yud is just a little dot, so it has no substance. So it's a spiritual entity. The Hey is full of substance. It's a structure. What does a Hey look like? A Hey is basically is like an upside down U, but with a little break between the left leg and the top. So it has a roof. Okay, got that? Has a right leg connected to it, so it's like a right angle. And then it has a left leg, but the left leg is not connected to the top. It's a broken space. And there's a space between the top and the left. So they explain like this. So why is it Behei? Why the Hey created this physical world? Because the Hey has 3 legs, or 3 lines. Machshava, dibur, amais. Thought, speech, and action. Okay. One line is thought, and it's connected to speech, because speech has to always be connected to thought. A person who speaks and is not thinking, what they're speaking is usually either a drunk or something else. They're going to be incoherent. So speech needs thought to guide it. Action, as I mentioned before, can leave and be separate from the other two. You can write something, a book, and then never be near that book again. You have people. Because action changes something permanently, as I said. So that's reflected in the left leg that's separate. Or in the words of the verse, it goes, L'kfeidi b'rosiv yitzativ, af asisiv. Which means my honor I created, I formed, and I also made. So asiya, when it comes to action, there's always that, called pregnant pause if you wish, that separation. And of course it's a tremendous lesson in life, that when you speak and think, okay, that's connected. But before you act, you should always pause. So there's a space between the top and the next. So there's always a pause, because when you act, you cannot reverse it. Even speech you need to think about, but it's not quite the same. Ein achar ma'aser klum. Once you did something and act, everything changes. And you see this all the time. Look at the Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge. So in their minds, they could have had all kinds of thoughts. And all of us can have negative thoughts, even thinking about doing things inappropriately. And many of us come and say, since I thought about it already and I spoke about it already, what's the big thing? I'll act on it. No. Once you act, there's no return. Then you lose the innocence. You are a changed person. A person who acts. Everybody has at times some type of, criminal thought, some negative thought. But that's a thought. You control your thoughts and you don't act on it. Once you act, there is no return. Even if nobody knows right now, an action changes things. Because as I said, it has that invested power of the divine. Speech is more intimate and more intense in its pure firepower. But it does not have that ability to change things. So that's why behave, you need a hey to create this world. Spiritual worlds, a yud is enough, a dot, a spark, and that's that. You want a world like this, you need to have the thought, the speech, and then comes the action. And that action has a power that nothing else has in this world. Now, on one hand, you could say that's a very simple thought. It is. But when you think about it in a very deliberate way, it changes a lot. Because first of all, it changes how you behave. And also understanding that we have the power to change things. I'm talking for the good. Obviously, it also means the opposite. You can change things in ways that are unalterable and in permanent ways, even though it's just an act. So yes, one act can make all the difference. Thought and speech are guides. They can help guide the way, but they don't have the ability to change things. Now, obviously, there are times a person's thought leads to all kinds of other things, and so can speech. Sometimes you say akimas fasav havamaisa, which means the movement of your lips. Speech also has an element of action, but it's an element of action. Obviously, you speak, your lips are moving. There's a form of action, but it's not the same. Even then, it's not the same. Prayer is a form of action, but it's primarily more speech. And study of Torah is primarily more thought with some element of speech. So the action becomes the most paramount force. So though it's true, as I said at the beginning of the class, that what makes us unique is thought and speech compared to other species, because they don't have quite the abstract thought and speech we have, the ability to communicate with each other, the ability to argue with each other as well. And similarly, we're much closer to them in action. Action, every animal, every creature has a form of action. Even a plant acts, whether it thinks or yet, in that sense, we do have something in common. As the Bible says, the Torah says, God took earth from the ground, so that's mineral, and turned that into the human being. So we human beings also have an element that is very physical. We're not just a soul. Yes, he imbued a soul, he blew and breathed the soul into the nostrils, but it was in a substance, in a piece of clay, in earth. So the Baal Tanja also explains in another place in Torah, he says, because the human being is meant to elevate the entire world. And to elevate a world, you have to elevate it from the bottom. You can't elevate a building from the middle. So a human being has the elements of mineral, as well as vegetable, as well as animal, of course, as human. So thought and speech are more our human qualities. And action and deed is something that we have in common with everything in this physical world. But an informed action, a sacred act that's informed by thought and speech can transform the physical world of action in which we live. So as you know, this world is called the world of Asiya, the world of action, as opposed to the higher spiritual worlds of formation, creation, Atzilus, the divine, unity, because it's in this active world and through our actions that change everything. When people say, I'm a good Jew at heart, yeah, it's not enough. It's action. It's just like the investor that says, I'm with you with my heart, but I'm not going to give you a check. What is that worth? When Ariel Sharon, the general Ariel Sharon, who later became prime minister, after the 6-Day War, he was one of the big heroes of the 6-Day War 50 years ago. And the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, then had come up with a campaign, a mitzvah tefillin campaign, for many different reasons. So he was by the Rebbe, Sharon, and he said to the Rebbe, why tefillin of all things? Why not say a prayer? Say Psalms. When we're in a time of need, what do Jews do? They say Tehillim, a prayer. So the Rebbe responded, which was in his usual way, finding an example from that person's life. He says, let me ask you, you're a general of how many soldiers? Thousands of soldiers. Why do you train actual training exercises? Why is it not enough to just read military journals? Why do they have to put themselves even in any physical strain? He says, because they need to be trained. When real war comes, they can't just rely on theories and books. They need the physical training, just like the exercises that condition you and prepare you for that one day. It could be you train 99% of your life just for that one, and sometimes not even once, that you'll need it in real time, God forbid. And he kept on pushing. Why not the books? He says, books are not practical. They're theory. So he said, that's exactly what I was talking about. That's why An action, tefillin, to bind your mind and heart, not just to read a book about it. The Mezritcher Maggid, who was this great student of the Baal Shem Tov, and he essentially was the teacher of all the Rebbe, the different rabbinic dynasties. So he had a friend, when they were young, they used to study Kabbalah together. This friend came to see him in Mezrich many years later, and he now was the great Maggid of Mezrich. So he came to daven in the morning services in Mezrich. The minyan, the prayer service ended. Everybody left home, but the Maggid was still sitting in with his talis and tefillin davening under the talis. And this friend hadn't seen the Maggid in many years, said, he'll wait. An hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Finally, the Maggid finished his davening. He waited respectfully, and they say Shalom Aleichem. Oh yeah, of course they knew each other. The Maggid remembered. It was a reunion. So he said, I have to ask you something. We both studied Kabbalah together. We both had the same teachers and masters. We learned how to daven together, with all the kavanas and intentions that is required, based even on the Kabbalistic intentions. I davened today. It took me half hour. You took 4 hours. Can you explain to me what's the difference? So the Maggid asked him, what do you do? Like, what do you do for Parnasa? He says, most of the year I study and pray, but a few times a year, twice a year, we go to Leipzig, the place, big marketplace, and we purchase merchandise, and then we go back, and my wife and family, they sell it to the local merchants, and we make that's how we make our living. So Maggid says to him, how long does it take you to travel to Leipzig? He says, it's a trip, it's a few weeks. You travel, and a few weeks to be there, come back, around a month every year. So Maggid says, why do you have to bother to go schlep there and find wagons, and find a place to sleep, and all the hassle? Why don't you just stay home and meditate how you go to Leipzig, and you're buying merchandise, and you're coming back and selling it. You meditate on it. So the guy looks at the Maggid, this man, and says, with all due respect, you're a batlin. You know what a batlin is? How do you translate batlin? You're not with it. You're not grounded. You're absent-minded, basically. You're like in a different world. So the Maggid says, why? He says, because medaf ham deschere. I need the material. It's not going to help me meditating here and thinking about it. I need the material to come back and sell it tangibly. So the Maggid said, exactly. I need the material too when I daven, go on a journey. Meditating is very nice, but if you want the material, you got to go there. And that's why it takes me 3-4 hours. Which basically was saying that you're meditating on it and I'm traveling. So there's something about actually traveling. Now, what the secret of traveling like that is another discussion, but it means it's not just a nice idea. He actually goes wherever he has to travel spiritually to get what he needs to be able to transform his life. That's what action does. It's not a theory. It's not just, okay, it's a great theory. Let's think about it. There's something that's done, and that move, an action, that goes over that split, that space from the thought and speech to the left leg of the hay, it changes everything. Changes everything. And in that paradoxical way, action connects what's called in Hasidic terminology to the etzem itself. Mitzvahs misyachsis ala atzmus, the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Chabad Rebbe said. Because the action connects to the core intention in the highest possible levels. Again, informed action. It has to be directed and guided. That's why you have to have Talmud. But the Talmud has to be Mevil de Maisa. Now, just to answer quickly the question, if that's the case, why when Mashiach comes, won't we need, why does it say only Maisa? The answer is precisely because, for example, you wake up in the morning, do you need to look into a book to tell you you're hungry? No. You don't need to study. You don't need to go to school. You don't need any training. Your body tells you you're hungry and you go eat. Even newborns cry for food and they know how to swallow. So today we need Talmud, we need study to tell us what to do. You walk down the street, should I go here, should I go there? What's allowed, what's not allowed? There's no instinct. Tzaddikim have an instinct, but most of us have no clue what's spiritually healthy, what's not healthy. If you didn't know what day in the calendar was, would you know it's Shabbos? There were people that did know, but most of us don't. When Mashiach comes, the world will be so saturated with what is aligned with the divine will and what is healthy, just as your body will naturally crave food and water and oxygen, your soul will know what to do, what not to do by action. You will not need someone to tell you. You won't need a Shulchan Aruch. So of course the question then is, so why will they be studied then? So the Baal Tanya writes in the 4th section in Tanja, in the Epistle 26, Chavov, explains, then Torah will be to reach higher levels of unity with the divine, not to know what's right and wrong. So today we need that. I just wanted to add that since I asked the question already. Anyway, I hope I did some justice to this power of action thing. And really, when you think about it, how we look at ourselves in the way we live our lives, in the faculties that I discussed, the garments, but at the end of the day, it's the final garment, the Maisa, that has more power, more action, more power than the greatest thoughts and greatest ideas. Which is why when you train children, you don't just train them with great ways of thinking. You train them behaviorally. You do this, you do that. Not because behavioral is simple, because behavioral changes everything. And behavioral change is rooted in the deepest levels of the soul and of the divine. Again, it needs to be informed, it needs to be educated, it needs to be guided and directed. You can't just follow actions without some direction. But if it doesn't come into the act, you're missing not just a component, basically the punchline. The entire thing is not fulfilled and consummated and realized. So may our actions throw the world for a spin, have a ripple effect, the butterfly effect, and actually create change, as the Rambam there says, Maimonides writes, that one action brings tshuva atzola, salvation and healing, salvation and repair to you and to the entire world. So here we are. Every Wednesday we begin around 8:20, 8:30, something like that. So it was a pleasure speaking to you and being in touch. And please be in touch. We'll be here next Wednesday. And if you don't get the emails, please send your email, let us know. So we will put you on the list. So at times when we don't have the class on location, we can announce different changes in schedule and formats. So everyone be well. Have an action-based week and informed by the thought and the speech. Everyone be well. Thank you. Very good. Okay.